they have a lot of severe consequences for civilian populations, especially in targeted countries. And they amount to what, essentially I and many others argue as collective punishment of civilian populations, just because of what, the policy of the United States is towards their government. They violate international laws. And from a kind of realist conservative standpoint, even, I say that they're not even effective at achieving the desired results of kind of the mainstream US foreign policy establishment, and is actually counterproductive in kind of those efforts too. So first, a little bit how it works internally in the US. There's a few ways that sanctions can be enacted, but the most common way is through presidential decree, through executive orders. And so the president is granted sweeping powers through declaring a national emergency. And this is done through a law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act that was passed in 1977. Ironically, it was passed to limit the president's authority over sanctions and to provide congressional oversight, but the opposite is occurred. So basically, the president can declare a national emergency based on very, very loose terms and very vague. Basically, they can say that anything is an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, or the economy of the United States. And that gives the president a green light without congressional approval to a basket of powers to affect commerce and trade between US companies, US government, and other countries in the world. And then secondary sanctions, which I'll get to a little bit. And just some numbers, 54 national emergencies have been declared under IEPA, and there's 29 national emergencies that are still active. It may be 30, but the last I checked was 29. And we've had one on the books against Iran since 1979. So you can tell these aren't really national emergencies. They aren't short, unusual things. They're pretty much just blanket powers given to the president. And what's important, though, is these emergencies spill over successive generations. So, Trump has used emergencies that Clinton and Obama have enacted, and they stay on the books and they just get renewed every year. But especially right now in the Trump administration, sanctions have been used way more as a tool, as a coercive instrument. Around in the past 2 years, the number of new sanctions per year have gone from like 400 to 1,500 new sanctioned entities every year, adding up to 8,000 to 9,000 sanctioned entities in total. And of course, Congress can also enact sanctions, and they have, especially even when Trump has been in office. Democrats in Congress have voted for sanctions through either bills or adding them to the National Defense Appropriation Acts. And that's been a way. But the crucial way is through the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, through executive order. So I want to talk a little bit why U.S. economic sanctions are particularly unique in the world. And the reason for that is because the US dollar system, the international financial system, where the US dollar, access to US dollar and access to US banks plays a crucial part in the circulation of goods and services. And the dollar is the global reserve currency for about 62% of the world. Half the loans worldwide are denominated in dollars. 40% of the international payments are processed using the dollars. And the US has the power basically to dictate who can participate in this global system simply by managing who has access to dollars and the financial instruments to clear and settle dollar transactions. A big way this happens is through the correspondent banking system. And I won't try not to get too in the weeds with this, but I think it's a big part of why US sanctions are pretty powerful. A correspondent bank is basically when one bank holds deposits owned by other banks and provides payment and clearing services. So since most trade is in dollars, most major multinational banks in other countries, they maintain a correspondent account in the New York Federal Reserve. and they rely on their relationship to do international trade. And smaller domestic banks within the countries around the world rely on these multinational banks, which then have accounts in the New York Federal Reserve. So let's say, a company in country A wants to do trade in dollars with a medical company in country B. They don't just transfer the money directly in dollars. First, the domestic bank goes to their multinational, which goes to the New York Federal Reserve, and there they transfer to the multinational of country B, which goes to the domestic bank in country B, which goes to the receiving company. So in that whole process, the US plays a linchpin in the whole operation. And the Treasury Department, granted with the authorities of these national emergencies, can pretty much intervene in that whole process. Another way that US intervenes is through messaging systems such as SWIFT. If you've ever sent a international wire, you know that SWIFT is a crucial part of that. And the US doesn't actually own it, but it controls it basically. It's based in Belgium, and the US can basically dictate if the SWIFT can process transactions from Iran or whatever country the US wants or doesn't want. Another system is CHIPS, the Clearinghouse Interbank Payment System, which processes a huge amount of international trade, and the US directly can control that. So understanding a little bit about the financial channels and the way that the dollar system is pretty dominant in the world, it gets us to what is probably the biggest impact of US sanctions, which are secondary sanctions, which means the US doesn't just block trade between the US and another country directly, like selling oil, carpets with Iran from the US company to Iran, but they can actually sanction entities and countries that have nothing to do with trade with the US. For example, a European country that wants to do trade with Iran, because that European country has to rely on the US dollar system for a lot of its trade, the US can basically say that any trade that happens in dollars is under our jurisdiction, and the US can sanction that secondary party. And that's right now under the maximum pressure with Iran and Venezuela and Cuba and most countries. Secondary sanctions are the key sanction that I think harms mostly humanitarian trade. Because, I mean, most countries, they rely on going to the New York Federal Reserve or rely on US markets. So the US can just cut them off completely from the dollar system, from the US market. And companies get naturally afraid anytime sanctions are levied, especially broad sanctions. There's legal costs, there's personnel to navigate all of the different requirements and steps it takes to transact in a sanctions environment. And so a lot of these companies do what's called over-compliance, which means that even maybe there's like technical work-throughs that permits them to engage in certain trade, they just, self-censor. They don't do that because of the costs. The cost benefit doesn't weigh in their favor, and they risk becoming pretty much an economic pariah if potentially by just one misstep in trying to process goods. And another key point to give perspective is when doing trade, it's not just one company and one company. You have to think along the supply chain, how many different entities and companies that are along that have to make that cost benefit analysis on whether they want to risk it. So we're talking, if you want to buy oil, we're talking about the tanking companies, the insurance companies, the creditors. And if one or two of those in that chain get sanctioned or get cold feet, then countries are constantly scrambling to find different links. And that can be a really exhausting process, very difficult process, very onerous. And that's some of the ways, I think when we're talking about the humanitarian impact, there are exemptions on paper a lot of the time for US sanctions for what we call humanitarian goods, medicine, food, agricultural materials. And there are carve-outs. The State Department constantly will tell you we have humanitarian exemptions. Don't worry, everything's fine. But most of the time, these exemptions, they don't go far enough. For example, there's a lot of items that are considered dual use, where, you know, technically it can have a military use, but it's mostly used for civilians. So the U.S. says no. And then even when there are exemptions for medical devices, right now it's a big problem with COVID because there's a lot of medical devices that require a special license. For example, PCR machines to do tests, oxygen ventilators, a lot of disinfectant gear, and you need a special license for that. And to do that, you have to go through the Treasury Department, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, get a special license, which sometimes can take 3 months, or sometimes you're waiting for 2 months and you don't even get, you know, you get a no from them. So companies will, you know, they'll abstain from that trade because it's too onerous. So I think my time is up here, but I think the other panelists will sort of talk about the specific humanitarian impacts of those sanctions.
And today I'll discuss some context around North Korea and the impact of sanctions. But before I start, I want to thank New Jersey Peace Action for hosting this conversation. And also I'd like to thank Hyun Lee, Ju-hyun Park, and Soy Jang, as well as all of my comrades at Nodutdol for helping me with these slides. And also to everyone else who's joining us in this conversation for yet another Zoom call. Thank you so much for being with us. So this here, now it looks like I'll be able to share my screen. Let's see. All right. So this is the outline of my talk today. I'll discuss the context of US and UN sanctions in North Korea, the kinds of sanctions that have been put in place there, as well as some human impact, some of the human impacts of these sanctions on ordinary people. What I mean by ordinary people are generally kind of non-elite people. And then I'll have a short call to action for us so that we can imagine how we can transform our world, especially in this moment, which seems like a rupture. Overall, similar to the speaker before me, similar to Cavan, I'll argue that sanctions are indeed forms of warfare by limiting trade or communication with specific entities. Sanctions actually harm people, families, and communities from determining their own lives. And there we go. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK, I'll use that acronym interchangeably with North Korea. But trade with North Korea has been restricted since 1950, which is the official start of the Korean War. And this is under the auspices of the 1917 Trading with the Enemy Act, which is a US federal law that gives the executive power to restrict any and all trade between the US and its enemies during times of war. I'll return to the slide in a moment, but I'd like to turn your attention to this background image, which is Pyongyang in 1951. Pyongyang is the current capital of North Korea. And by the end of the Korean War, 75% of Pyongyang's buildings were destroyed by US air raids, which also left much of the country in ruins. The war was devastating, particularly for the northern part of the peninsula. So much so that in 2017, this is in the era of fire and fury. If you follow Korean politics, that might kind of resonate with you. In 2017, the DPRK government reflected, quote, "The US once waged a tragic war that plunged this land into a sea of blood and fire." And they continue, "and has been leaving no stone unturned to obliterate the DPRK's ideology and system century after century," end quote. So this for us notes that the DPRK really sees the Korean War as an ongoing geopolitical situation. And then in this next slide here, we have historian Bruce Cummings wrote to reflect. He wrote, "There are 25 million human beings living in North Korea. They bleed like we do, they live and die like we do, they love their kin like we do," end quote. So I want to emphasize that this is where my talk begins, with the war and the beginning of US sanctions in North Korea, and that these geopolitical circumstances have deep human impacts. And because the Korean War never formally ended, North Korea has been under US sanctions ever since, which is why this slide reads 70 years of sanctions since the war is in its 70th year. I'm gonna fast forward for the sake of time, but despite the carpet bombing and mass death that occurred during the Korean War, until the 1980s, North Korea was more economically sound than the South. And that changed in the 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed and North Korea experienced a series of severe floods. You might know that the country is covered in mountains, and in the north, mountains make up 80%. And mining is the heart of North Korea's economy. So when the severe floods waterlogged the mines, the economy stood at a standstill. And because the socialist trading bloc had collapsed with the USSR, North Korea could not import fuel and thus couldn't generate electricity to then pump the water out of these mines. US sanctions cut off North Korea's access to trade with other countries, and all of these circumstances compounded and led to mass food shortages as well as a humanitarian crisis. And this period in North Korea is known as the Arduous March. And so the dominant thinking in Washington was that if North Korea is unable to provide for the needs of its own people, then the regime will reach a breaking point. And so the Pentagon began to draw up plans to invade and occupy North Korea in the event of regime collapse. So moving to the 2000s, you might remember in 2002, George Bush declared North Korea as part of this axis of evil. And then in 2003, the US invaded Iraq. So recognizing the escalation, the military escalation, this is also when North Korea decided to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and develop a nuclear deterrence program. And I'll return to the slide, but this is Article 10 of the NPT. It's important to note here that it states, each party shall, in exercising its national sovereignty, have the right to withdraw from the treaty if it decides that extraordinary events related to the subject matter of this treaty have jeopardized the supreme interests of its country. And all North Korea had to do in order to announce this withdrawal was to provide 3 months notice in advance to the UN Security Council. These kind of extraordinary events, of course, refer to military escalation that's noted here in this slide. The DPRK's withdrawal was not welcomed by UN member states, and in particular, the US, which is of course not a signatory of the NPT. But since then, UN Security Council and the US have piled on a series of sanctions on North Korea, amounting to a near total embargo. So I think all of this, this brief context asks us to meditate on this question: what are these sanctions supposed to do? So just to give a bit of scale, I have a list of a number of sanctions that are put on North Korea. So the first slide refers to US sanctions. And here, I'll get into some of the specificities later, but here just to show the number of them that have happened since Bush, but also a renewed round of sanctions under Obama, which exacerbated diplomatic efforts between the US and the DPRK. These now include a list of UN Security Council sanctions, and arguably the UN sanctions are more comprehensive because it implicates all member states and keeps them from having relationships with the DPRK. Originally, it began as sanctions targeting the military and elite, and then in 2016 moved to encompass sectoral sanctions targeting the DPRK's main trade industries. It's led to an incredible list of banned goods, which fundamentally imposes on civilian life, and in the context of this pandemic, a lot of medical equipment. So this includes things like X-ray machines, farming equipment, any materials with metal. That includes kind of water purifiers, and then the list goes on to include ultrasounds, medical dental equipment, and also agricultural equipment, water treatment equipment, etc. And what these sanctions also lead to are caps on fossil fuel imports and coal exports, export bans on minerals, textiles, and agricultural products. These three industries are the DPRK's top three. International banking restrictions, which Cavan had outlined regarding the US dollar hegemony, bans on old and new joint ventures with DPRK, as well as a ban on work permits for North Korean foreign workers, which has led to repatriation. What this means is that these kinds of caps and sanctions isolate economies. It stifles the economy's ability to engage diplomatically. It cuts off people's access to food, clean water, life-saving medicines, and then also causes malnutrition, poverty, and preventable deaths. So when Democrats specifically say things like, and it is across the aisle, but especially they say things like, we oppose war, we want diplomacy, because, and let's use sanctions as a way to, as an alternative to warfare. This is the type of logic we need to be questioning. Violence exists in multiple forms, and from North Korea to Cuba, Iran, Venezuela, sanctions kill innocent people all the time. And it's in fact these liberal governments that will often impose sanctions justified by ideas of diplomacy. And this slide shows us some numbers of people who died in 2018 because of shortages and delays. Of the near 4,000 people, 4 out of 5 were children under the age of 5 years old. And then 72 of them were pregnant women. So these figures highlight that sanctions cannot be tools for diplomacy. And of course, everything that I've outlined so far is even further exacerbated during a pandemic, which we can get into in Q&A. And while people living in sanctioned North Korea are reminded of the ongoing war every day, most Americans don't realize that the Korean War never ended. And in the US, it's often called the Forgotten War, which here, this is a memorial in Olympia, Washington. It's carved into stone. And so only when North Korea began to develop weapons that threatened US interests did the US see this crisis. But for us, for Koreans, the problem goes way back to the US occupation of Korea after World War II and its central role in the division of the peninsula. And in the South, it led to tens of thousands of troops on the ground, nuclear weapons, military dictatorships, and annual war games to rehearse the collapse of the North Korean regime. And so this has had a lot of implications for inter-Korean cooperation, which we can also discuss in Q&A. People on the Korean peninsula have lived under constant war threats for 70 years since the Korean War ended in an armistice and there was never a peace agreement. And so where we start this story matters for our conversation about sanctions in North Korea. The problem didn't begin with North Korean weapons, and therefore the solution is not sanctions, but rather it's the unfinished business of ending the Korean War. And so it's time to end the Korean War to create the conditions for peace on the peninsula. Sanctions have time and time again proven to be coercive forms of warfare. And so I'd like to point you to the poster on the left, the Korea Peace Network, Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network, the Peace Treaty Now, and Women Cross DMZ. These organizations together are organizing a virtual advocacy week from June 1st to 5th. And participants will be lobbying congressional representatives to support 3 different pieces of legislation that pertain to Korean peace. So if you're available and interested in participating, please let me know and I'll put you in contact with the organizers. To note, there is a training webinar on Thursday evening, which will offer more information. And then also, I'm a member of Nodutdol. We're on every social media platform if you have any questions and would like to learn more.
Diana? Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be part of this important discussion, and thank you to the panelists who've just gone before me. Again, my name is Diana Dort. I'm the Director of Policy and Strategic Engagement for MADRE, MADRE being an international rights organization that partners with grassroots women-led organizations that are confronting war and climate disaster all over the world, and indeed are also confronting, in many cases, the impacts of US sanctions. I'd like to offer two main points to the discussion. First is, as you were saying, a look at the gendered impacts of sanctions around the world and in many of the places where MADRE works. I want to talk about how women and girls are disproportionately impacted and how their labor sustains communities, especially when other options to meet people's needs are stripped away. And secondly, I'd like to talk about the emerging concept of feminist foreign policy and how it can offer alternative frameworks to confront these pressing global issues. There's so many reasons why this conversation about sanctions is so urgent right now, even as we know, as the panelists who went before me have said, the sanctions have long been and increasingly are a foreign policy tool of choice for the US across administrations. But right now, especially right now, at exactly the moment when countries need to be able to marshal crucial resources to prevent the spread of the coronavirus and to protect their communities, US sanctions are effectively tying countries' hands and making it nearly impossible for them to mobilize the needed response. And a few country examples can show us what that looks like. You know, in Iran, sanctions have most recently been part of what the Trump administration's so-called maximum pressure campaign looks like. But they've also been a feature of past administrations of US policy and have triggered food and medicine shortages in years past. And since abandoning the Iran nuclear deal, Trump has ratcheted up sanctions several times, including as the pandemic was exploding in mid-March. And on top of this, the US recently blocked Iran's attempt to get an IMF loan of $5 billion to combat COVID-19. And so this is clearly a deliberate and even stated strategy to strangle the country's economy. And I'll come back to that point in a moment. And so sanctions have forced Iran into a deep recession, and sanctions are making it difficult for people in Iran to buy items like ventilators, face masks, medicines to treat COVID-19 patients. Thousands have died already, with more than 140,000 confirmed cases. So the real toll is maybe far higher. And as Cavan was saying, in theory, medicines are humanitarian supplies that should be exempted from US sanctions. But in practice, sanctions restrictions do reduce Iran's ability to pay for those much needed supplies. And what's more, by limiting oil production and export, sanctions can cut away the revenue that is needed to pay for essential goods. And that is exactly the point. Secretary of State Pompeo said as much back in January when he was bragging about the fact that there had been an 80% drop in oil revenues, adding to his earlier comments where, at some point he had said, things are much worse for the Iranian people, as proof that sanctions were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. And that is to make life harder for ordinary Iranian people, as part of some ill-conceived notion that it'll make people want to rise up and demand regime change. So clearly, not only is this morally bankrupt strategy that violates international law, there's also little evidence that that cause and effect actually exists. But meanwhile, there are signs that sanctions have weakened social movements, including women's movements. They make it easier for women's rights organizers to be painted as being against the government, against the country, just like the authors of the sanctions that cause so much pain. So they weaken the perceived legitimacy of their grassroots demands, and it makes it difficult for activists in Iran and others to connect with organizers across borders and to build collective power. Venezuela is another place where the US has embarked on a years-long campaign of regime change, and sanctions are the Trump administration's tool of choice to weaken the current government. But what they've actually done, as a study by CEPR has shown, is killed at least 40,000 people in Venezuela between 2017 and 2018. And also a former UN Special Rapporteur who visited Venezuela said that the sanctions could amount to crimes against humanity. And so now, in this moment, as coronavirus hits the country, Venezuela lacks sufficient test kits, ventilators, personal protective equipment, electricity, soap, water, you name it, all the essentials to be able to stave off the pandemic. Another country example I want to raise is in Syria, a place that has suffered years of war and devastation. There were clear signs even before this pandemic that sanctions were killing people. The World Health Organization, the WHO, warned that sanctions were preventing the import of vital medicines, despite, again, claims that those were necessities that would be exempted. The sanctions were preventing many international pharmaceutical companies from dealing with Syrian authorities, drug companies not wanting, they don't want to run afoul of the restrictions, so they operate with extra caution, over-compliance, as Cavan was saying. And the result is critical medical shortages. And again, that was even before the pandemic. So now, in a country whose health system has been ravaged by war, by the pre-existing impacts of sanctions, it's unconscionable that we would now continue to put barriers in the way of life-saving medicines. And in all of these cases, the impacts of sanctions are not gender neutral. Women and girls in many communities around the world, they often shoulder the responsibilities of securing food and water and fuel for the household, and so are disproportionately impacted by economic sanctions. In part, that's because sanctions make basic necessities like food more expensive and make that provisioning role more difficult. When public systems are unable to meet those needs, women and girls often fill that role in providing at-home care because of common gendered divisions of labor and caregiving. It's also worth noting that the question of food and hunger has arisen as a particular emergency in this moment, with what the UN has called a hunger pandemic emerging. Recently, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food has said the continued imposition of sanctions on places like Syria, Venezuela, Iran, Cuba, and Zimbabwe, and on actors in Yemen and Gaza undermines the fundamental right to food. Another point, the impact on the health sector has particular effects on women's reproductive and maternal health care, which has resulted in worsened maternal and child mortality. What's more, women and girls who perform the majority of caregiving work are also disproportionately represented as frontline and healthcare workers in many places, and so they have greater exposure to the virus. And because of sanctions, may be less likely to get the care that they need. What's more, women who work in industries that are sometimes explicitly targeted by sanctions, like retail or textiles, are likely to become unemployed and pushed out of the public sphere. This has been the case in places like North Korea, Haiti, and Iraq. And this trend is exacerbated due to the economic fallout of the pandemic. One other gender-related impact point I want to make is that economic sanctions also combine with the current pandemic to worsen gender-based violence and discrimination. So COVID-19 has meant that more people are sheltering at home and sometimes are trapped with their abusers and cannot seek services, domestic violence services, for example. So this is triggering an increase in domestic violence around the world, and as sanctions worsen economic collapse, pushing more people into poverty and leaving more people unemployed, they have fewer protections against violence, lacking, for example, the financial ability to leave a violent relationship. So having established the devastating nature of sanctions and their gendered impacts, the question becomes, how can we disrupt this dynamic? How can we move towards a paradigm shift away from this bipartisan, years-long reliance on sanctions as a foreign policy tool? And I'd like to offer that a key way to engage in that paradigm shift lies in feminist thinking, which can help us shift perspectives and reorient values. This is the underlying promise of feminist foreign policy, which has already begun to gain some purchase with some governments like Sweden and Canada, but which also offers a lot for progressive policymaking right here in the US. And the flip in the script of feminist foreign policy, gears us towards values that undergird our policy and that have been dismissed because they're seen as feminine or as weak. So it would gear us towards cooperation instead of domination, or it would gear us towards balance and sustainability instead of perpetual exploitation. And feminist foreign policy thinking can also uncover certain often unspoken assumptions that undergird US foreign policy. and that shape our understanding of what makes a proposed policy considered to be realistic, efficient, or effective. And I think a lot of us are familiar with these common and frankly patriarchal assumptions that, for example, that war is a natural and default response to conflict, a reality that, clear-eyed realists can recognize, but that naive peace activists and feminists are too weak to recognize. These assumptions also tell us that the best expression of strength is violence and that compromise is weak. And so feminist thinking has been confronting these patriarchal assumptions for generations in the private realm and in the public realm. And feminist foreign policy allows us to bring that lens into the policy space and point out the consequences of this thinking. So to bring it back to the sanctions discussion, it can help reveal how, when war is seen as a natural resort, other destructive policies, even those that may sicken and starve entire communities, like sanctions do, those policies can be manipulated to seem kinder, gentler, or more peaceful by comparison. And another important point is that feminist foreign policy calls upon us to center the voices of those who are most impacted by US policies in order to shape better ones. So that means, in this case, the voices of women who may be organizing or people who may be organizing to sustain their communities amidst the deprivation of sanctions. And the good news, I would say, is that we can see that there's some shifts in perspective around sanctions that are happening. So even right now, as the Trump administration is doubling down, and even as right-wing US think tanks and policymakers are pushing against sanctions relief, we do have a glimmer of hope that animates our organizing. Increasingly progressive policymakers have been challenging the long unquestioned practice of imposing sanctions. There was, recently that there was dozens of US senators and Congress members who urged the Trump administration to suspend sanctions against Iran. There's the Congressional Oversight of Sanctions Act that was recently introduced by Representative Ilhan Omar, which limits the president's power to impose economic sanctions without congressional approval and provides increased protections to shield humanitarian aid and healthcare and critical infrastructure from sanctions. So those are all positive signs. And I just want to conclude by saying, and I don't know how many sci-fi fans there may be out there, but I wanted to share some words by the science fiction writer Ursula K Le Guin, who once gave a speech about how the world needs, quote, realists of a larger reality. And in this context, when we see support for sanctions or for other acts of warfare put forward as the realist or hard-nosed approach, we can understand our role to be the realists of a larger reality. And then that means that we can all see this larger reality and work towards it to make the devastating consequences of sanctions and other forms of warfare and aggression fully visible, and demand that we integrate those realities into our policymaking decisions. And so in our larger reality, these devastating coercive actions would be unthinkable, which would leave room for the types of policies we need, which are collective, rooted in care for one another, and that are grounded in human rights. And I'll stop there.
If everyone could just start their video back up. Thought I had unmuted myself. Thank you all very much. If you could all unmute yourselves as well, I'm going to go to the Q&A box, and we will, there's a number of questions that have come in. And the first one is addressed directly to Minju. What can you tell us of what the people of South Korea want done or changed in US policies towards North Korea? What do progressive leaders in South Korea, in or out of government, want the US government to do?
Wow, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. I think to answer this question, it's very much about kind of peninsular politics. What North Korea and South Korea, I think, together want is conditions for peaceful resolution of this war in an effort to be able to collaborate and reunify and make it possible for a future where we can all be sustainable and live together. Oh, sorry, this question box keeps moving on me. And I've now lost it. Could you repeat, Jeff, do you mind repeating that question for me so that I can answer it in its fullness?
I apologize. No, I cannot.
Okay.
Wait,
What is for, I mean, what's certainly true is that these sanctions impede inter-Korean dialogue and cooperation. And progressive South Korean organizations are certainly aware and concerned about the impacts of sanctions, both in North Korea, but also what it means for South Korea. South Korea is still under US military occupation. And so this is indirect, I mean, it's justified because of the threat that North Korea allegedly poses to the other half of the peninsula and then also to the Pacific. But really, in reality, for South Koreans, it means having weapons installed in the countrysides. It means having gas masks available at the subway stations. It means kind of always being aware of the war. And so I think South Koreans are certainly, I mean, especially in the kind of with the new administration, but then also more as far as grassroots organizers, there's certainly energy to try and create peaceful conditions in an effort to imagine a future together.
thank you, Minju. I am going to jump around just a little, just to cover a couple of different topics. One question I would like to know, what lessons, if any, were learned from the sanctions on Iraq during the years prior to the Iraq War? Not addressed at anyone particularly. Is anyone on the panel that would like to take that question?
I mean, I can jump in briefly, at least on that question, because it's something that's very much tied into the work that MADRE has done in Iraq over the years. So those sanctions that were in place in the 90s were devastating. And we, at that time, partnered with local Iraqi women's organizations to not only shine a spotlight on that reality, and it's much of the same reality I was pointing to before about reducing people's access to food, reducing people's access to medicine. There's evidence to suggest that it had devastating impacts on child mortality, on community health. And so what MADRE did at the time was to work to again spotlight that and to bring direct humanitarian aid through local women's organizations that could distribute it and that, you know, had a sense of where the need was greatest. And I think in terms of lessons learned, you know, unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of those same dynamics playing out. We're seeing a lot of, you know, those threats playing out in places that are targeted by sanctions. And it's important to continue to draw out that history. You know, as Minju was saying, it's a decades-long history in the case of North Korea and in other places as well. And so the social movement organizing that builds on that history can be all the more powerful.
Thank you, Diana. I'm going to take a question that was emailed in. Can you tell us where we can find information on the international laws, where they can be found that prohibit the use of unilateral economic sanctions without the approval of the UN? Cavan, do you have any insight on that? I don't want to pick on you, but would you have any insight on that?
Yes. So the UN has a special rapporteur. The full name of it's a mouthful, but it's the Special Rapporteur on the Impact of Unilateral Coercive Measures on the Enjoyment of Human Rights. I can send a link to Jeff to send out to everyone, but basically it is essentially a rapporteur under UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And she has been documenting all of the various places within UN laws, UN charters, treaties that that basically say that unilateral coercive measures are illegal. So just a brief explanation. Technically, in UN speak, what the US does unilaterally is not considered a sanction under international law. It's considered a unilateral coercive measure because legally speaking, within the UN, sanctions can only come from the UN Security Council. So that's a thing. But also the rapporteur and others have said that even UN sanctions, like on DPRK and Iraq in the past, those are that UN charters and treaties actually say that those are illegal as well if they want to be internally consistent. But yeah, I can, if you go to that website, which I can give Jeff, or I can put it in the chat, there are several reports by this current rapporteur and the previous one, and they flesh out all of the different international violations, international law violations of sanctions.
Thank you, Cavan. Let's see, two-part question, actually one question. Obviously, the Trump administration has no problem with the terrible human cost that sanctions can and do impose on countries on the list. However, how much hope do we have that Democratic legislators do not also support continuation of these measures? Getting into some political aspects of this. Anyone want to jump in on that? I'll jump in briefly. The support for sanctions is wide across both parties. We do need to work on both parties. There is a lot of support for US sanctions. There is some work going on right now on the Democratic side to relieve certain sanctions, but even those don't get wide support. There is a lot of work to be done on both sides of the aisle, for sure. Does anybody else want to jump in? Feel free.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, I mean, just to echo what you said, there is movement towards recognizing the negative impact of sanctions. There was a letter headed by AOC and I don't know how many other representatives, 30 or so. Someone may have the actual number, and it was specifically only about Iran sanctions and COVID crisis. So it was a very narrow, short-term letter, but I think that it, like, slowly, this conversation is becoming more mainstream. The conversation about lifting sanctions and questioning it. Even, I mean, there's a letter from international leaders, and even Madeleine Albright, who was the architect of the Iraq sanctions, the most deadly sanctions regime in history, and she doesn't even apologize for it. But even she signed a letter saying that U.S. sanctions against Iran and other countries during COVID was not a good thing, was an abomination. So that shows you kind of how things are shifting, but there is tons of work to be done. A lot of offices just don't really want to touch it, to be honest.
Great, thank you, Cavan.
And I think to add to, I think this question really hits it on the head. Often sanctions are used as a diplomatic strategy, and certainly in the case of North Korea and the Korean War generally, it's hard to get legislators and congressional representatives to really stick to a party line or some sort of line regarding whether they want diplomacy and or sanctions. So it's often, yes, we want diplomatic relations with the DPRK, but yes, let's also impose sanctions, which is, I think, I mean, given the panelists today, I think this is not kind of the same thing. And yet it's often used as if it is a diplomatic measure. But I do think like webinars like this is the way that we can sort of have these conversations that will then hopefully kind of correct the narrative on sanctions. More and more Congress people are aware of the impacts of sanctions. And I think just being able to kind of clear up that narrative is really important.
Thank you, Minju. This may be the last one because of time constraints. From Kevin Martin. Awesome quoting Ursula Le Guin, love her. Also thanks to Ms. Duarte for the emphasis on the feminine foreign policy. Question he has, and I've tried this, but not consistently over time. Is there a value to calling out US foreign and military policy as racist? It certainly is true over time in many manifestations, but especially now with sanctions. The U.S. just does not value the lives of people of color in other countries. Comments, answers?
I can, there's two things I want to say in response to this comment or question. One is the feminist value that was articulated by Black feminists of intersectionality is a really important one here. And for just to put it in a nutshell, recognizing that there are many different forms of oppressions that may be intersecting in an individual person's life and in our communities and in our movements. So recognizing that gender oppression intersects with racial oppression, intersects with many forms of oppression, and that holistic approach to our thinking actually allows us to create better policies. So that when we understand that policy that has a particular gendered impact, that policies do have particular gendered impacts in the ways that they will have particular class-based impacts or particular race-based impacts. And so to have that all be part of the conversation actually allows us to create better policies. And the other point I would say is that it allows us to recognize that the domestic picture is not so distinct from the foreign picture. You know, that these national boundaries sometimes obscure more than they reveal, and that the way that U.S. policy treats people of color around the world, we can see resonances and connections to the ways that people of color and communities of color are treated right here in the U.S. And when we're able to build those connections, we're able to build stronger movements. So that people right here in this country who, you know, we're often told that people here don't care about foreign policy, and it's not an election issue, and it's not a real political issue, and it's not the way you're going to motivate people. But if you're able to build those kinds of transnational connections where people see their own lives and their own communities as in connection with others, when you're able to break down those boundaries, and I think that by connecting the experiences of people of color, of women, of people of various identities across national borders, when you're able to do that, you build stronger movements, including movements for and to confront militarism.
Well, with that, I want to thank everybody. Cavan, Diana, Minju, thank you so much. This is obviously a topic we could spend days on, and an hour does not give it the right amount of time to be able to spend on this. There are a number of questions left. If you don't mind, I'm going to email them out to the different panelists and see what kind of answers we can get back, and we'll send them out to the list. In the meantime, a brief call to action. There are things we can do as activists and as progressives, whatever you want to label yourself as. To build broad political support for any of this stuff requires a broad effort by the constituency of any particular representative. As Diana just alluded to, Washington is thrown when they get calls and emails about foreign policy. They don't often hear from their constituents about it. So talk to your representatives, talk to your congresspeople, talk to your senators. There are right now COVID-19 stimulus bills being worked on, and we need to work language into the next round of these bills. Senator Markey and Congressman Levin have introduced the Enhancing North Korea Humanitarian Assistance Act. We'll be getting emails out to people to make phone calls and send emails to their congresspeople to get that into the next round of stimulus bills. And another piece of legislation that Diana did allude to as well is HR 5879, which is the Congressional Oversight of Sanctions Act, recently introduced by Congresswoman Omar. We will also be getting out some emails on that, on action you can actually take to try to affect change. It requires broad support. It requires bugging people in Washington to do what we want them to do and to do the right thing. With that, I want to say thank you to all the panelists. Thank you so much for your time. This has been a great hour. I wish we had more time. Thank you to everybody in attendance. Thank to all the groups that helped us promote this. And we'll see you all again very, very soon. Thank you and good night.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.